All I can tell you is in 6 years we've run thousands and thousands of scans for customers. I have never, ever got a scan result and a list from a prospect or a customer and had them match. It just doesn't happen. People do not know what they are using, and the reason you don't know what they're using is not because anyone's done anything bad. Developers come and go. When you download open source software, it's bundled with other software. So there's a lot of reasons. So you need to track what you're doing. One of the ways you do that is to scan or audit some of the code. And then lastly, develop some sort of checklist so your developers know what to do. Right? So a policy is, I think, sort of a component of existing in the open source ecosystem. Right? So understanding licensing, and I apologize if this is a primer or a remedial lesson for some of you, but I know when somebody didn't understand copyleft. So an open source license actually has a definition. It must be approved by the OSI. This is usually a policy statement that someone puts in their policy. If we're going to use open source, it has to have an approved license. Why is that? Well, because then you know what you're obligated to do and there's some sort of precedence or standard. You know what behavior your organization needs to have. There are over 60 approved licenses today and literally hundreds of derivatives. Now, the key criteria to get approved, you got to give the code away for free. You got to make sure the source code's available. You can allow someone to use it for derivative works, and you can't discriminate on who you give it to. Seems pretty straightforward. Right, so the licenses are categorized in a couple of general ways. This is not all the licenses, but you heard Worley just talking about permissive. This is permissive. This is a liberal license. So if possible, you know, for some people, their policy, depending on what their use model is let's allow things like this. If your use model is distribution, copyleft means, you know, you got it for free, you can use it for free, but if you create anything with it or you contribute any changes to it, those have to go back. They've got to go back to where you got it, back to the community. So that's the whole notion of you know, infecting your software, I guess, infecting your IP, because if you have to then give your IP back to someone, that is usually viewed as a bad thing, right? So two basic general categories, lots of different variants in the categories, and projects sometimes, and this might be another thing, you can sometimes pick this license. So let your policy statement reflect, if you have a dual licensing option, we will always select the most X license. Now, for a business user, maybe you're always focused on liberal. Do we have any software developers, ISVs in here, software vendors? Okay, so software vendors sometimes view it the exact opposite way.
Developers.
Yeah, so from the business model, software developers development shops might look at it and say, you know what, we're going to give this away, but we would like to have the contributions, require the contributions to come back so that our product can get richer over time, right? So understand the licensing. Second tier of understand the licensing has to do with dependencies. Not going to go into a lot of detail with this, but anybody ever heard of an open source project called Spring? Right, so Spring is a pretty popular project. Spring has over 60 dependency projects bundled within it that represent at least 8 different open source licenses. So Spring carries one license to it, but there are dependencies in it that are licensed under different licenses. So you have to be careful about what you're bringing in. So you need to look at the dependencies and the bundled projects because A, they may not be the same. You can find some that are simply at odds with each other, that one requirement of the license says do X and the other says you cannot do X. That's a problem that you have to resolve before you ship. So they can have multiple and conflicting obligations. So Geronimo is an Apache project, uses MySQL, which is GPL, through the MySQL driver, which used to be GPL, but now it's not. So you have Apache, you have GPL, and you have LGPL all in one download. So understand that you need to be aware of the dependencies. Right? So once you understand basic licensing, then start to craft a policy. And one of the things you need to think about in your policy I call this a thin layer of control. And I would caution you, and did anyone here ask the culture question in the room back there? But if you didn't ask the culture question, there was an answer given to it that said, you can't change the culture, the whole entire thing, right away. The same thing with your policy, right? You start somewhere really sort of small and lightweight. Pick some very simple things like, what licenses do we allow? If someone wants something different, how do we address it, right? What kind of approval process? And then how do we make sure people are complying? Because if you don't do that, you might as well not do that. And the big thing I would say is to keep it simple, keep it lightweight. I have a policy from a customer here. It's literally 68 pages. And don't try to start with something like that would be my guidance to you. And don't let fear sort of drive you. I shared a bunch of FUD with you, but you should really let the business guide you, not the fear. So why are we using open source? What are the reasons that it is here? Is there any risks associated with that the business can or cannot live with, or that I want to maybe fence in, right? And let that guide your policy, not sort of the FUD that you're reading, right? So here are the basic elements of your policy. I will put these slides up, by the way, on SlideShare, but you're welcome to jot this down. The ones that I have checked are the ones I'll talk about a little bit. I don't think I could talk about all these things in 45 minutes. So strategy, pretty important. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer, but you have open source or you wouldn't be in here. Why do you have it? Right, so is it a stated goal or is it just an accident? You can cover things relatively simply here about where should they get it from. Is there any sort of criteria it has to pass before you get it? Does anyone need to pre-approve it, right? I think those are relatively straightforward. I won't cover those in general. I'll cover strategy, how to track it, how to scan, how to stay in compliance, and the formation of an open source review board. If you don't have one of those, that's probably the very first. If you took one takeaway from here today and said to get a policy, what would be the first thing we do? Create an open source review board. And an open source review board should have a business leader, should have a legal representative, and a technical representative. And those three people together can help drive the decision-making process. All right, strategy. You need to ask yourself, are we pro-open source? Are we con? Or are we neutral, and why? The customers that we talk to typically let risk drive this. So I would suggest that there are different risk models. If you're just using it as a standalone application, that's a certain degree of risk. If you're bundling it with other apps and building software with it, represents another degree of risk. If you're embedding it in something and shipping it out your door, that's yet another risk. This is an example from one customer, how they categorize their risk, and it's not hard. Red light, yellow light, green light, high, medium, low. A high risk is something that they feel has a legal risk. They're distributing it, it's going out the door, or it's in a mission-critical app that's customer-facing. And there's no a license with it that they've already pre-approved. A medium risk is that same customer-facing application. It's mission-critical, but there's no distribution, they don't see a legal risk. But maybe the community hasn't been around more than 4 years, so it's a new project. And a low risk is everything else that doesn't fit in those categories. So they kept it relatively simple. This scoring matrix is automated for them, so they can, everything's sort of computed for them behind the scenes, so no one has to really think about that. The second thing I'd say is, as they're using it, once they've adopted it and it gets out into their development environment, they need to track where it is. And I get this question a lot from people, okay, well, if we've already decided what our strategy is and people are following the rules, why do I need to do this? Why do I need to track anything? In your policy, I would suggest tracking your usage for a number of different reasons. Number one, it's a standard best practice in your software development lifecycle. I mean, it's no different than any other code. If you're buying commercial code, you're tracking where you deploy it so you don't exceed your licenses. If you're building your own code, you're tracking, milestones and releases. You should track what you're doing with open source. That also helps you find out, as you try to do that, you may have expertise in your company you don't even know about. As soon as you sort of raise the flag and go, okay, open source is a good thing. We're going to try and capitalize on it for these reasons. And we're going to try and understand more what we're doing with it. People will start to, this phrase, I don't know if it'll come out right, they'll start to come out of the closet, if you will, from a, don't ask, don't tell policy. This is a Forrester term. Open source is moving from don't ask, don't tell to strategic adoption. You will see that happen. You need to make sure that you know what you're doing in terms of complying, right? So a lot of reasons why you should scan. When you have maintenance releases, you'll know where to go. One of my customers called this the 100-300 problem to me. They said, we know we're using 100 pieces of open source. When there's a security patch, I don't know where to put it. What does that mean to me? I'm using, Tomcat, there's a security patch on it. I don't know maybe where I've deployed it, every server, every physical box, everywhere in the company. So it's not that hard to do once you start tracking it. So understand when maintenance and security patches come out and what kind of level of support that you need. And then when you are tracking it, it's just sort of a list here of what to track. There is a standard industry initiative that IBM is part of, Intel's a part of, a lot of vendors are a part of, Motorola's a part of, called SPDX, which is a software package definition exchange, which literally will spit these results out for you in a standard format, so you can think of it like the ingredients label on a